All right. Well, speaking of books, Jesse, this is the first episode that'll air in April, right? We're recording it, I mean, in May.
Yep.
Yeah. We're recording it in April, but it'll be the first one that we release in May. And what's our tradition is the first episode that we either record or release in each month. I discuss the 5 books I read in the month before. And though it's only the 28th, I have, as is my habit, long since finished my 5 books for April. So I figure we can talk about them now in our standard what I read segment. All right, so in April of 2022, the first book I read, and we talked about this on the show, was The Seven-Storey Mountain by Thomas Merton. So you'll remember this is the story. It came out in 1948. It was a memoir of Thomas Merton, who had grown up with his artist father, traveling throughout Europe, ended up in the States, ended up at Columbia, was sort of intellectual writer, started teaching English literature classes, and dropped everything and became a Trappist monk at the Garden of Gethsemane Trappist monastery in Kentucky. And the Trappists, if you don't know, are pretty far on the ascetic end. We're not out there in the community also having jobs, and we're not Jesuits that are also astronomers. It's like, no, we're chopping wood and waking up 4 times in the middle of the night to say prayers. So it was about that transition. Anyways, it's very influential. It's very influential because it came out during this post-war doldrums period where people were adrift and moving to suburbs and getting boring jobs. And so this book of reinvention and focusing on depth and values in a radical way. I mean, this is a clear example of my notion of the deep life in action, really struck a chord. So I figured I needed to read it because so much more that's recent is informed by it, whether the authors know it or not. We talked about it before because I tried to read it on Kindle and I was like, nah, this book can't be read on Kindle. I need a hardcover. But instead of just like a normal person buying a hardcover, I went back and bought a first edition, first printing from 1948 of the book. I think it really mattered. I think it really helped. I think it really changed my experience of reading the book. And it's a long one. It's 400 something pages, and in the original hardcover, which are wide pages. And they didn't mess around with this sort of business book you buy in the airport in the 2020s, double spaced lines and giant fonts. They didn't mess around with that back in the 40s. People had time. So the lines are small. So it took me a while to read. But I'm really glad I did. I'm really glad I did. I know more about Catholic practice now than I ever have before. So I recommend it. It's a foundational book that so many more self-transformation books, all of the big self-transformation books that follow in the 20th centuries were informed by Seven-Storey Mountain. And he's a good writer. All right, so speaking about writing, I then went on to read Anne Lamott's Bird by Bird. I had never read that. Now, I had read the other famous writing instruction book. So Bird by Bird, if you don't know, is Anne Lamott's book about writing. It's a book about writing. Now, because, as you might expect, I've internalized the patriarchy, I had read Stephen King's book on writing, probably because of the male gendered gaze was more comfortable for me than the female gaze or what have you. But for whatever reason, I had never read Bird by Bird. But it is right up there with Stephen King's On Writing as one of the 2 most famous nonfiction books about writing from the last, 3 or 4 decades. I like Anne Lamott. I mean, I like her writing. I like her as a person, just her, excuse me, like just her approach to life. She lives and she's had an interesting, difficult life. And I always go deep stalker mode on the houses of writers. And so she bought this cool piece of land in Northern California that was kind of run down, and they slowly converted it over time into this like oasis. I love that type of stuff. The book is good. It's focused on fiction writing. And I'll say the main thing I came away with, other than Anne Lamott is a great writer, the main thing I came away with is fiction writing, I think, attracts more aspiring writers than nonfiction. Because on paper, becoming a success seems easier. And what I mean by that is when you read Bird by Bird or you read Stephen King's book and you read about novel writing, the only real activity you do is sit down at a computer and write. And so it's all about that, like just sitting down there and writing and overcoming the psychological fears. So in theory, if you've never written anything before, um, you have all of the tools and things you need to potentially write a great novel. You just have to sit down there and write. Where nonfiction, uh, excuse me, seems more scary, right? It's like, I got to get a book deal first. You don't write nonfiction before you get the book. I got to go actually talk to people. I got to do interviews. Um, so it seems harder. But the reality is when you read something like Bird by Bird, is like, oh my God, fiction's so much harder. Like, yeah, you can just get going, but man, it's just you and the screen, and you have to just craft out of nowhere these characters and narratives that reveal the human experience, and do so with perfect craft, because any deviation from perfect craft is going to ring out. Where in nonfiction, I don't know, you just have to be competent. I have something to read about. I did research on it. If I just do the work to do the research, and I know how to write in a way that's not going to annoy people, like, you can be in the game. So I think this is the allure of National Novel Writing Month and fiction writing and Bird by Bird, is like, maybe if I just sit there at the keyboard, uh, Of Mice and Men is going to come out. But I think it's way harder. So I'm glad I'm not a fiction writer. That just seems like it's impossible. It's like trying to be a screenwriter. Everyone's like, I bet I could do that because I know movies. Movies seem straightforward, and it's impossible. It's impossible to actually like write, because everyone can do it, but to do it well, it's like near impossible. So anyways, a good book makes me glad I'm a nonfiction writer. And to all you aspiring writers out there, nonfiction is actually it's way easier in my opinion to like be a working writer than in fiction. All right, then I went on and read some fiction, because April had some good weather. In good weather, I like to have fun books to read. So I went and read the Carl Sagan novel Contact, which actually I really enjoyed. So it was a premise of the book was it focused on someone at SETI, SETI, Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. And Carl Sagan works through what would happen if we actually did get a signal from an alien civilization. And the parts I like the best actually is he works through the science of how that would work. You know, like, okay, it would be a signal on this frequency that corresponds to the emission frequency of hydrogen, and there would be pulses corresponding to the prime numbers, because that would be really universal. And then they're using various modulation schemes to encode information into those symbols. And so, anyways, I thought that was real interesting. So I really loved the part where he got in, whenever he would get into the science of like how alien communication would work, and how we would track it down. I love those parts, but there was pretty good characters as well. I mean, it was a good book, and I love when scientists write books and they're good. The only nerd comment I need to make, my apologies to the Sagan estate. Actually, no apologies. It's not his fault. It just it's a demonstration of how things have changed. Um, so the book takes place like in '99, and so he gets wrong. He gets right a lot of things. He didn't get the internet right. So they had instead these like portable fax machines they would carry around that like would they would like send and receive messages through portable fax machines. Like, he wasn't quite there on the internet, but was pretty close. But the small nerd detail that I noticed is the aliens used for one of the layers of encoding in their signal phase modulation. And in the book, Sagan's like, oh, we don't, phase modulation is something that theoretically you could do, but it's not something that we use really in like human devices. Like, we know about it, but it's just not something we're used to. Based on my understanding, phase modulation is actually now heavily used in wireless data protocols, like in particular in 802.11 protocols for access points. Like, phase modulation is at the core of it. So that was a prediction that was gotten wrong. In the age of Wi-Fi, phase modulation is well used. See, so what I'm doing here, Jesse, is I'm giving the people the information they really care about. You cut past the superfluous and you focus in on what is it that the crowds really care about. And look, if there's one thing I will say about Deep Questions listeners, they are RF modulation fans.
Yeah, you got us primed up for your comments about Jurassic Park a couple months ago.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, forget any mistake I said about Jurassic Park. The overlooking the importance of phase modulation. mean, let me get going about QAM constellation encoding. This all came from, by the way, so again, no one cares about this. I'm mainly a theoretician, but I do theory, or I used to do theory about problems that were motivated by wireless networks. So for my postdoc, for my 2 years as a postdoc at MIT, I left the theory group and I went up to the network and mobile systems group and learned a lot about how wireless network technology actually works. So there you go. It finally paid off in allowing me to do an awesome, cool critique of Carl Sagan. I don't want to say that makes his book a garbage book, but if you're going to get modulation wrong, I mean, I don't know, guys. I don't know what we're doing here. All right. Then I went on and read a book I found in a little free library at the field where my oldest son was playing Little League called Blue Latitudes. So this is Tony Horwitz. I'm a big Tony Horwitz booster. He died a few years ago, like at the age of 60. Just tragic, just like heart attack, just boom, streets of DC, fickle finger of fate, which was really tragic. Fascinating guy. Talk about a writing power couple, by the way. So he married Geraldine Brooks, the novelist. When he married her, he had a Pulitzer from his war correspondent reporting. And then not long after they got married, she got a Pulitzer for one of her novels. I don't know if it was March or The Crossing. So it's a dual Pulitzer couple, a nonfiction writer and a novelist. But anyways, I mean, the book probably his most famous book is Confederates in the Attic, which is a fantastic book, the first Horwitz book I wrote. But he does these are like nonfiction travelogue type books. In Blue Latitudes, he was tracing Captain Cook's journeys through the Pacific of the 18th century. And so he's going all over like remote Pacific islands and all the way up to the Aleutian Islands in Alaska. And he's really good at this travel writing because he's a Pulitzer Prize winning war correspondent. So he knows how to go to these remote, interesting places and insert himself into interesting situations and find interesting people. He's twitchy and high energy and is just constantly trying to find places to go and people to meet. And he's so it's interesting. He does interesting things. And so in this book, he's doing interesting things. He's on these islands you've never heard of, meeting these characters who capture so interestingly, like the life on these islands and the impact of colonialism, etc., written beautifully and just interleaving with the story of Captain Cook. Great book, but long. It's another 450 pager. So it took me a while. So I had two 450 pagers this month. So I was surprised by how long that took. The final book I read, this is a bit of an odd one. This is a deep pull. Uncle Petros and Goldbach's Conjecture. As a long process by which I came to this book. It is a novel written by a mathematician, a Greek mathematician named Apostolos Doxiadis. So between this and Sagan, as you can see, I'm on a kick of scientists writing books about their field. And the book is about, it's like a young boy and his uncle was like this super math prodigy who became obsessed with trying to solve Goldbach's conjecture, which was at the time one of the three big famous number theory conjectures that hadn't been solved. So you have the Riemann hypothesis, Fermat's last theorem, and the Goldbach conjecture. Fermat's has since been proven by Andrew Wiles. Was the Riemann solved? Can you look that up, Jesse? The Riemann hypothesis. I have this vague memory of this Reimann. I have this vague memory of this eccentric mathematician George or Goreg or something solved it and didn't even show up. But I might be thinking about something different. So you have to fact check me on that. Anyways.
Wikipedia says many consider it to be the most important unsolved problem in pure mathematics in the first paragraph.
So what did he... Oh, look up. I think he solved Poincaré's conjecture. Poincare accent aigu conjecture. Maybe that's what he solved. The guy I'm thinking about. So Jess is going to fact check that.
Yeah.
Maybe that's what it was.
Originally conjectured by Henry Poincaré
Yeah.
in 1904, the theorem concerns spaces that locally look like ordinary three-dimensional space.
Yeah. Was it solved?
Attempts to resolve the conjecture drove much progress in the field of geometric topology during the 20th century.
Was there a guy whose name started with G who solved it?
I'll keep on looking.
Yeah. Anyways, the point being, there was something famous solved, and the guy was this weird eccentric. I think he was Russian, and he didn't even show up for. I think he got to give him like a Fields Medal or something. He didn't even show up. But anyways, this book was sort of about a character like this. So it's a math prodigy who became obsessed with solving this conjecture, and basically his life fell apart because of that. And it is from the perspective of his son, who kind of uncovers this, and so it's cool. It's a short book. I wouldn't say there's a lot of sophisticated plot in it. There's like long periods of just exposition of like, let me just summarize my uncle's story. And it kind of just tells the story, but it's really cool because he puts in a lot of famous figures from logic and number theory and analysis. So Turing plays a role. Kurt Gödel shows up in the book. He's hanging out with Rajanaman and Hardy at Cambridge. And so it's cool. It's like all these mathematical cameos. Not much really happens, but I love to see specialists in their fields write fiction about their fields because I want to do that one day. So maybe that's why I was reading Sagan and Uncle Petros.
You should have used your French accent.
Yeah, the proper pronunciation is Henri Honkai is how, if you're going to be sophisticated. You're saying, you're like, that's good. I remember when the guy from Russia solved the Henri Poincaré conjecture. Yeah, that was good. So do we figure out, is that the thing he solved?
I was reading through the Wikipedia. Wikipedia is unbelievable.
Yeah.
This one guy tried to solve it in the 30s, but then it was retracted. A bunch of other guys tried in the 50s and 60s.
Well, I'm sure there's some nerd listening who's a bigger nerd than me who will write in, and please do.
An exposition of attempts to prove this conjecture can be found in the book.
Because I'm thinking about
Cares Prize by George Spiro.
Because this is what I'm. All right, someone has to write in. There's someone who solved something hard in the last 10 years, maybe the last 15 years. And his name was George, and he's Russian, and he's eccentric. And it's not the Riemann hypothesis. Doesn't sound like it's the Poincaré conjecture. So, all right, someone has to write in and set us straight.
I got a quick question.
Yeah.
So before you would say that you read 2 chapters a day before you bumped up to 5 books a month, right?
Yeah.
So what do you think you read, like 4 chapters a day now?
It's uneven. Yeah. So, I mean, part of what happens is when you take advantage of quiet time to like go nuts. Like once you're in the habit of reading, you're looking for times to kind of go nuts and read. And so some days you don't get that much time in. You just have your standard times you read. And other days you're like, ooh, I have, a half hour. Like the kids are with my wife and they're coming home and they won't be home for a half hour or something. And if it's your default activity, you lean into it. You're like, great, I can really, and once you get into the books, and I talked about this in the podcast last week, that once you no longer are using your phone as a default source of distraction, and conversely, you've gotten really into like the books you're reading and the idea of reading books, and your mind is used to that, you begin to crave it. It's great. You're like, this is what I wanted. Like everything slows down. The leisure is deeper. Your brain gets quiet. Your thoughts get clearer. I just really am more and more of an advocate of this is the medicine people need right now.
Were any of the 5 audiobooks?
None of those 5 are audiobooks. I'm listening to the first book from the Expanse series, sci-fi series. I'm listening to that on audio, but it's long. It's a 40-hour book. So I was listening to that off and on throughout. And then I'm also listening to the Steve Martin's professional memoir, Born Standing Up.
I just finished that actually.
Yeah, I mean, I'd read it. Obviously, it was influential in my work, but I read it in 2007 or something. So I don't remember. There's so much I don't remember. So anyways, I'm enjoying that. I'm almost done with that as well. I'm actually, so I have 3 books I'm reading simultaneously right now, and I'm pretty close on all 3. So like, I'm once we cross over the May boundary, I'm probably gonna be 3 books in, you know, by the first week of May, because I just kind of I have a bunch going in parallel right now. I actually miscounted. So I was on we were on a little trip to the beach when I finished the fifth book, and I thought it was my fourth. So I had like a lot of other stuff going, and so then I spread out. It's like, well, let me make progress on a lot of books so that I can finish them all. So I'm just off schedule now. So like I'm finishing stuff like halfway through a month and kind of starting the new stuff. It's just my reading's not scheduled with the start of the month, basically.